Boeing, ladies and gentlemen, the American aircraft maker Boeing is all set to set up an assembly line here in India. One of the world's biggest aircraft manufacturers is looking to set up a production line in India. So we're going from anything from a small chip to a huge aircraft being made in India, and global companies which make this for the entire world wanting to move to India to make it out of India. Kartik, chips are one thing, advanced chips are another thing. Aircraft are another ball game altogether. Aircraft assembly line in India, and that too Boeing, no less.
Huge, absolutely huge, as big as the aircraft, if not bigger than that, right? So, absolutely. I think, there's no doubt that, again, like everybody else, Boeing is also seeing great potential in the amount of orders that India is booking with Boeing and with Airbus. I'm surprised actually that Airbus was not the first one to announce it. It's Boeing. But I have no doubt that sooner than later, Airbus is also going to want to shift assembly to India. And simply because look at the number of aircraft Indian airlines have sort of booked with both these, and it's a duopoly, right? I think it's a pure duopoly between Boeing and Airbus. There isn't a third as big, as large an aircraft maker. Of course, you have the likes of Embraer, and you have the likes of Cessna, and you have some of these other smaller companies, but nobody produces commercial aircraft at scale the way Boeing and Airbus do. Up until now, the rumors were, or the sort of aspirations were, that both Boeing and Airbus are going to further intensify their MRO setups in India, which is your maintenance, repairs, operations, etc. Right? So you were hoping that MRO would come to India. So every time there's a faulty engine, or every time there's a faulty part within the overall aircraft, it does not have to be grounded indefinitely. You don't have to wait for parts to come from some other corner of the world, and you don't really have to ground tons of your fleet until repair work happens. But so of course, so MRO was basically the aspiration, but here we're talking about complete assembly lines, which again make immense sense, because hopefully with the kind of traffic at airports India is seeing, with the number of flyers taking to the skies, with the kind of aircraft order that the likes of Indigo or Air India or other smaller companies are now placing with these global aviation manufacturers, I think it is only obvious that Airbus is going to be next.
Right, and you're talking about MRO is maintenance related, whereas what you're talking about here is FAL, or final assembly line.
That's right.
Now you have the India head of Boeing say that the final assembly line is doesn't have as much value, say, as in say smartphones or wearables or one of those things. So it's about 10% of value addition for an aircraft happens in the final assembly line, and as the demand for aircraft from Indian carriers grows up, you have Boeing looking to set up that final assembly line in India so that the deliveries can take place faster than usual. But it's a good time to remind everybody that in the recently concluded Paris Air Show, you had Boeing plus Airbus receiving orders from India worth $120 billion. That's the size of demand. As a kind of business, we're giving $120 billion worth of aircraft ordered by Indian carriers. You have Indigo, you have Air India, both of them. Massive orders to both Boeing and Airbus, the duopoly that we're talking about, $120 billion. And before this, as far as aerospace is concerned, India was exporting components worth about $1 billion before that. And I think, from Boeing's perspective, you hear that India head Salil Gupte talk, and he's talking about the fact that final assembly line is one end of the things, but idea is to make engines from India. Absolutely. And that's where the real game is when it comes to making in India, aircraft making in India, isn't it, Kartik?
Totally. But I think that is still a long way ahead, and it's a steep climb up. And look at what India, let's say HAL, did with the Tejas or the LCA, light combat aircraft engines, been in production manufacturing some stage since the 1980s. And until now, we don't have a reliable engine. And that is what led to the deal between Rolls-Royce and, General Atlantic and General Electric's, GE, and India to have this transfer of technology up to 80%. Some reports suggest that 80% of the technology will be transferred to India for HAL to be able to manufacture those jet engines in-house. Now, you are hoping and looking for such deals to happen with large commercial aircraft engine manufacturers like, let's say, Rolls-Royce or GE, or even Pratt & Whitney for that matter. So you're looking at large TOT, transfer of technology memorandums to be signed as opposed to pure assembly. But I think let's take everything as it comes. MRO, great news. Final assembly line, definitely good news. If nothing else, at least you're engaging a large chunk of Indians into an employed sector, into an organized employment sector. And of course, add to that the speed of delivery, the logistics of transportation, etc. All of that get eased. And now if you have assembly happening in India, I think any large manufacturer worth his or her salt is going to want to ensure that the suppliers are close by. You don't want to be in a situation that you're importing every single component from 20 different places in the world and only assembling in India. You need access to raw material, you need access to finished products, you need access to labor markets, you need access to land, and of course you need access to the final delivery, your buyer. So as long as you know that the buyer is here in India, the assembly through labor is happening in India, through land is happening in India, I think the only two components left now are going to be access to raw material and access to finished components that can be brought into the assembly line.
Right. Adding to what Kartik has been talking about, fact of the matter is that Boeing already announced a $100 million investment in India when Prime Minister Modi was in the US, and clarifying as to where that $100 million is going to go through. Here is the argument from Boeing. Boeing says that, global, as far as the world is concerned, India, it sourced worth $1 billion from India, even during the pandemic when sourcing was dropping from everywhere in the world because there were no aircraft flying over there. And somehow the sourcing from India for Boeing, largely 2/3 of it was manufacturing. So India already is one of the best original equipment manufacturers, or OEMs, as far as the aerospace business is concerned. And so that has remained stable, and that indicates the kind of demand that India has. Even during the pandemic, if Boeing is sourcing $1 billion worth of of components from here, that includes 2/3 of manufacturing, that says a lot about India. That's one thing. Add to that, this $100 million investment that Boeing is making in India, Boeing is again talking about the demand growth in India, which means that you'll need that many more pilots, that many more ground staff, that many more everything support staff to get Indian aviation where it needs to. And Boeing is saying that it's going to invest this $100 million in simulators and pilot training and getting the ecosystem ready when the aircrafts are done getting assembled over here. So in that sense, a very holistic effort that Boeing is making towards as far as India is concerned.
Totally. And as far as India's total order book goes, the demand India has for aircraft within this decade, before 2030 kicks in, we are looking at an order book of 1,300 aircraft already. India is going to have 1,300 new aircraft. Now, some of these numbers are clear because Indigo had placed an order for 500 aircraft with Airbus, not Boeing. Air India, prior to that, had placed an order of 470 aircraft, split between Boeing and Airbus. So this is already a 970 order book that we know of. And look at SpiceJet, look at
halfway through the year.
Yeah, we are halfway through this year. And of course, I mean, none of these deliveries are going to happen overnight. Even with the assembly line coming up in India, it's not that within a year or so these aircraft will start flying out of those assembly lines, ready to take off. But overall, that's the kind of order book that these aviation biggies already have from India, and this is only going to grow. So it's only obvious that you have assembly here in India. Now, the fact that some component sourcing was happening from India, a small component of the overall amount of components that go into an aircraft. But again, I think China's zero COVID policy helped us immensely. Why else would, during the thick of the pandemic, would they look at India for importing? Only because they had faced a supply chain constraint because Chinese factories were shut.
Yes.
India decided to open up much quicker. China, until mid last year, was completely shut. So we have been able to milk that opportunity well.
So milking the opportunity is one thing, and of course the demand growth, the growing Indian middle class, which can afford flight tickets, which wasn't the case, Kartik, when civil aviation took off about 20 years ago. Remember the first flights we took 20 years ago, and look at what's happening right now, and look at our own expectations from flights. Once upon a time, we were happy as we got a ticket, because in the 80s, to get a flight ticket, you need to be well connected, or you knew somebody at Air India. But by the time 2000s rolled around, we all could get tickets and take flights, but they were very expensive. Now we're back to come a full circle with more expensive flights all over again.
And I'm just wondering, Krishna, how many of those airlines are in existence today? You're talking about early 2000s, you had Air Sahara.
Kartik, the airlines of 5 years ago are not there.
Yeah, exactly. You had Jet Airways, you had Air Sahara, you had Indian Airlines.
My first flight was in Air Sahara.
Right, you had Indian Airlines, which pretty much became Air India and no more, government owned.
Yeah.
And then you had the first low-cost carrier called Air Deccan.
Yes.
Look at the fate of all of these. None of them are there. So that's how dynamic the
Air
Indian
Deccan,
aviation market has
right,
been.
Air Deccan merged with Kingfisher, and then Kingfisher got shut down. So yeah, it's crazy. But the fact of the matter is that the opportunity is huge, and the fact that a company like Boeing is seeing that opportunity, both in terms of demand for for aircraft in India and the market in India, and the India's ability to make aircraft components, and in fact eventually the aircraft assembly itself. So
now the beauty is, Krishna, that this assembly line is not going to cater to India alone. It's going to cater to the whole region.
Yeah, make it India for the world.
Yeah, and they will not have, let's say, Boeing or Airbus will not see the kind of potential in, let's say, a country like Sri Lanka. Not just today, even Sri Lanka 10 years from now, once it recovers from the economic turmoil it sees itself in right now. Even when Sri Lanka emerges from that 5 years, 6 years, 10 years from now, it's not going to still be, generating the kind of demand that India is generating. Look at Bangladesh. Look at Nepal. Look at our smaller neighbors. They are all going to have their economies growing, and they will have more need for civil aviation to take off, for passengers to take to skies, not just domestically within their countries, but even international sectors. And it makes immense sense for Boeing or Airbus, and I insist on Airbus again, because I think Airbus is seeing as much, if not more, number of orders from Indian flyers.
Correct.
And Indian aviation companies.
Yeah.
So I think it makes complete sense for them to have a strong foothold in the South Asian region, given the kind of growth which is expected to happen in the Asian markets, as opposed to our counterparts in the West, which have pretty much stagnated, and not just economically, but even demographically. So the kind of business that will get done in Asia, in South Asia, is going to far exceed the kind of business being done in Europe and US.
And that will be primarily driven by the domestic aviation markets of all these countries, especially India, because the number of people taking domestic flights will be a huge multiple of the number of people taking international flights, and more connectivity in India happens through flights and lesser dependency on the railways, hopefully going forward. A huge development. Bear in mind, it's going to take a while before this final assembly line of Boeing comes to India. But what it really tells you is the sentiment of companies like Boeing, and the sentiment that companies like Boeing are picking up from India and Indian industry. So it's like in Hindi they say "Tali dono haath se bajti hai," and in this case clearly "Tali baj rahi hai," and in the skies loudly. Here's hoping that our flight ticket rates come down eventually. That's all that I'm interested in at the end of the day. More aircraft, more airline carriers in India. Let carriers come and go. Let's have more people coming in than going. So so you average it over a period of time, and our tickets become saner at the end of the day.
But that's where the challenge is, Krishna. If there is price competition between ticket prices, then the loss-making airlines will continue to make even more losses.
True.
Because it takes forever for break-even to be achieved by aviation companies. And you need to have really, really deep pockets to be able to sustain this deep discounting on tickets. If you were to look at the break-even for every flight ticket sold in India, you will not be able to sustain even the high air ticket prices that you have right now. When you amortize the cost of the aircraft, you amortize the parking space across multiple airports, the salaries of the crew, of course, the whole aviation fuel and the logistics of
ATF prices have sort of stabilized in the recent past, thanks to crude oil prices stabilizing in the recent past.
Yeah, but they've stabilized on dollar value. INR has not stabilized against USD. So, I mean, we look at dollar prices and we say, hey, oil prices have stabilized, but Indian rupee is still depreciating. So it doesn't really add anything for us. So the point is that with deep discounting, or even if not deep discounting, if just simple price competition between aviation companies, the fact that you have a large ticket Tata's group already in the aviation sector, flying at least 3 carriers when you look at Air Vistara, Air India, Air Asia, right? And of course, the tie-up with Singapore Airlines, if you look at that entity alone, and then you look at India's largest domestic carrier, Indigo, there is a duopoly in India as well in the aviation sector. Now, for any other third player, fourth player to want to eat into a large share of the market, the kind of cash burn they will have to do is going to be so enormous that it's going to bleed them out. So the only option left them would be some sort of consolidation. So you either go back into the Tata, Air India, Air Vistara combine, or let's say an Indigo starts buying these ailing, and there were rumors that Indigo would possibly look at buying Go first, which it did not.
True.
But then you will eventually have a situation that the deep-pocketed guys are going to control the pricing, and that price cartelization is going to happen.
Right. Another point I'd like to make at this stage is, Kartik, they say that the Indian aviation industry is really not, meeting its potential until the time, Indian companies are able to take out flights for the entire world. International flights and the growth in international flights from India, and India being used as a sort of entrepot hub for people, like an Abu Dhabi or a Dubai or a Hong Kong. That's when, because look at the way we're developing airports across the country. So clearly, we're moving in that direction where India also becomes a transit hub, like an Abu Dhabi or a Dubai or a Hong Kong.
Totally.
And then you have more and more, flights going outside of India from India by Indian carriers. And I think, that eventually will sort of take care of the pangs of, high cost as far as domestic aviation is concerned, where price, is that much more difficult to arrive at and to be profitable. So here is hoping that Boeing, helps us manufacture a lot of aircraft going forward. A lot of that aircraft are used by Indian air carriers to fly to the US, where Boeing is from, or to Europe, or across the world, and the Indian aviation industry finally, reaches its potential at the earliest, and we are fingers crossed for that.